Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Morrow, president of the Springfield Area Chamber of Commerce. Very, very glad to have you with us today, joining for this program. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for a federal policy update with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're very excited to have them with us today. They've been just a tremendous resource to us and really to businesses all across the country during this particularly challenging time. We have a great program lined up for you, and I want to introduce our speaker for you in just a minute. We have a lot to cover today, and we've actually already received a number of questions submitted in advance. Thank you for those. We do hope to get to as many of those as we can. And in addition, if you have a question that comes up during today's discussion, a couple of ways you can get that to us. One, and the one that you're probably most familiar with, is to just email those to Lauren Musto on our team. Her email address is lmusto, L-M-U-S-T-O-E, at springfieldchamber.com. Again, that's L-M-U-S-T-O-E at springfieldchamber.com. If you email Lauren, we'll do our best to get to those questions. Anything that Jack doesn't pick up in his prepared remarks, we will certainly try to circle back to with your questions. And we also have the chat feature enabled on Zoom today. So if you would like to, if that's something that you're more comfortable with, please go ahead and utilize that too. We'll try to monitor that as well and make sure we get to as many questions as we possibly can and as we have time for today. Very, very hard to believe that it's already been over 6 months since the first case of COVID-19 was reported in Missouri. And since the onset of the pandemic in early March, 4 COVID-related federal relief bills have been passed to provide aid and assistance for many areas, including testing, but also support for state and local governments, education and healthcare, and of course, businesses and individuals as well. So at each of these various phases, there have been a number of specific resources made available for each of those groups. And based on feedback from our members, the Chamber has continued to advocate for additional investment in many of these key areas as federal lawmakers work through negotiations on a potential next round of federal assistance. That, of course, is complicated to say the least. And we're going to hear more about that today. And here to discuss the path forward for the next phase of relief is Jack Howard, and he's with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he's going to provide us with some updates on where these negotiations currently stand, along with several other implications for businesses as we move through the COVID recovery to what we hope is a prosperous future ahead for businesses. Jack Howard is the Senior Vice President of the Congressional and Public Affairs Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And in this role, he really helps oversee a team of 15 full-time Capitol Hill lobbyists responsible for developing and leading the U.S. Chamber's congressional lobbying activities. And Jack has over 25 years of government service, including coordinating legislative efforts under both Bush administrations and serving as senior counsel and advisor to Republican leaders of the House and Senate. Before joining the U.S. Chamber, Jack was vice president and chief operating officer of Wexler and Walker Public Policy Associates and received his bachelor's degree in political science from Gettysburg College. Jack, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. We're so grateful for the partnership with U.S. Chamber that's just been especially helpful over the last several months. We were speaking even just before opening up the program. It's been incredibly valuable as we've worked to keep our members informed, just the tremendous resource that you and the rest of the team at U.S. Chamber have been for us. Really appreciate you taking time to share your insights on what to anticipate in the weeks ahead. And with that, I'll just turn things right over to you, and we'll follow up with some questions after you've shared some of your perspective.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that very kind introduction. It's always kind of dizzying to hear. This is my 41st year here in Washington, and to hear a 41-year career collapsed into about 40 seconds.
That's 1 year per second. 1 year per second.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah. But anyway, no, I'm delighted to be with you all. And as you said, we were talking beforehand. We value the partnership every bit as much, if not even more, than you all do, because really you all are on the front lines out there in terms of trying to keep your businesses open, keep your employees employed, and just keep obviously your families and yourselves healthy. So we're very fortunate to be able in a position to help you all as much as we can navigate all this. So what I'm going to do is just kind of set the stage here, because I find when I do these things, it's easy. I think it works best for all of us if I just kind of try to leave as much time as possible for questions, so I can get to the things that you want to hear about, as opposed to maybe what I think you might want to hear about. So let me just kind of spend a few minutes here, kind of trying to get everybody kind of on a level playing field in terms of where things stand or don't stand. One of the things I've found over the years is that trying to predict or prognosticate on what Congress might or might do on any particular week or month or even day, for that matter, is always kind of a crapshoot. But in any event, it's not like looking through a kaleidoscope where you got lots of different colorful pieces floating around, and every time you spin it around, you get a very different picture. Some prettier than others, but in any event, things are very much in a state of kind of suspended animation here, with lots of animation. And I'll be honest, I'll be very candid. There's still a lot more we don't know than what we do know about what's going to happen, particularly in the near future, much less looking out over the next several months. So let's just start with some of the basics. The end of the fiscal year, September 30th, is rapidly approaching. And we've seen this coming for months. We've seen this play before. There are, if you look at the calendar, there are 15 days between now and the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. And more importantly, there's only 7 what I call legislative days until government funding expires. And by that, I mean days when both the House and Senate are in session. Now, they can always add a weekend or 2 or things like that, but it goes without saying that they're dealing with a very, very narrow window that's closing rapidly to try to get a lot of work done, not only in terms of government funding, but there's a variety of other issues that need to be dealt with in some fashion between now and the end of the month. The overriding priority at this point, obviously, just keeping the government open. Up until about a month ago, that was kind of taking a back seat to another, what they call phase 4. I kind of stopped calling it phases only because there's so many different variations on phases at this point. And your point was a good one. The earlier bills, it seemed like ancient history, passed in pretty rapid fashion, March, April, and then really started to kind of bog down getting into the middle of May. I'll get into some of the dynamics that explain that. But in any event, between now and the end of the year, end of the fiscal year, really the focus is shifting to how are you going to keep the government open? What kind of a continuing resolution is Congress going to try to pass just to keep the government funded? And I was talking to one of Mitch McConnell's staff people, I think it was last week. I've kind of lost track of time, but anyways, it seemed like it was last week. And she made the point that from their standpoint, if they can just get through the month of September without a government shutdown, that would be considered a victory. So very low expectations for the next couple of weeks. There does seem to be, in the abstract anyway, a notion from both the Speaker and from what we can gather, people in the White House, Secretary Mnuchin, that they want to try to keep this next continuing resolution, which, as we all know, just basically take current funding levels and extends them for a certain period of time just to keep the government open. And the idea is not to load it up with a lot of extraneous things. So when they talk about a clean CR, a lot of times that's in the eye of the beholder, because it's not a pure clean CR. Oftentimes there's a lot of things that need to be attached to that to deal with various what they call anomalies, quirks in how different agencies work that need to be addressed with specific pieces of legislation. So anyways, clean is in the eye of the beholder. And we'll see that the House Democrats are talking about trying to pass something next week. It's unclear at this point what it will be, other than this general notion that it'll be clean. But again, that's in the eye of, as defined by the House Democratic leadership. So we'll see what that means. The real question that is overhanging all of this is, okay, everybody wants to do a clean CR. For how long? there's different schools of thought on that. Traditionally, in non-election years, when the Congress has done a CR, they've usually done it until early December, mid-December. And then they finish the year with a colossal bang, I'm sure you've noticed, where they pretty much pack the entire year's work into one gigantic, what they call omnibus appropriations bill. And then everybody votes up or down on that. And that is the track, that is one track that could play out. The thing that's overhanging that is we have a presidential and obviously congressional elections coming up. So one school of thought is, particularly if President Trump gets reelected and if the Senate stays Republican, then the thought is they would do a CR till the middle of December, do their gigantic omnibus bill, and then go home and then start the new Congress again in January. The flip side is if Vice President Biden wins, the Democrats take control of the Senate. The thinking anyway, speculation is, they would do a continuing resolution until next year. This basically put the government on automatic pilot on the theory that the new administration, the new president, and new majority in the Senate would want to be able to revise a lot of the funding levels and a lot of the policies that get included in an omnibus appropriation bill. So we have two different scenarios. One school of thought, like I said, is the CR goes until middle of December. The other CR, the bet is that President Trump will lose and the Democrats will be in control, so they'll feel like they'll have a better handle on some of the funding levels and other priorities that are in the CR. So that remains to be seen. We'll see between now and next week. It'll be like a poker game. One of the tells will be from the Democratic leadership, how long do they extend the CR? So that's the House view. The Senate view is, as you can imagine, since the Republicans are in control, the Senate view is they want to do a shorter CR regardless of who they think might win the presidency. So you could have a collision at some point next week with the House passing a longer term CR, maybe going to, like I said, March of next year, send that over to the Senate, and the Senate says, no, we're not going to go that far. We're just going to go until December. So we'll see how that plays out. My gut feeling, which I'm quite candidly often wrong, is it seems like the most logical thing to do is to extend government funding. Both sides extend until December. Then they can kind of stand around and say, okay, who won? Who's still coming back? And then make a decision as to whether to do an omnibus appropriations bill at the end of this year or kick it over till next year. So of the things we don't know, there's, like I said, lots of those, but the one thing we do know is that the House is going to have to pass some kind of a continuing resolution after that. The other issue that then comes into play after all that, once they've kind of settled on the date, is there are a variety of deadlines directly affecting you all that Congress has already blown past. Earlier this year, I was naively thinking there's a bunch of deadlines coming up that will be action-forcing events. The unemployment benefits, as we know, expired at the end of July. The applications for the PPP program expired on August 8th. And I thought maybe that would be enough to get the two sides to a negotiating table to try to work out a broader deal. Well, that didn't happen. There was a variety of efforts to sit down and discuss. I wouldn't even call them negotiations because they never got that far. They never really got fast. Frankly, they never got past a lot of name calling and finger pointing at each other. But there were a lot of meetings between Secretary Mnuchin, Chief of Staff Meadows, Speaker Pelosi, and Democratic leader Schumer in late July and early August, in kind of a frantic effort to try to even begin negotiations. They never got that far. They broke up in a lot of bitterness and acrimony, even so much to the point where Speaker Pelosi said she's not going to talk to Mark Meadows anymore, only because, whatever, it's personal. So things broke down, and then things have been in a stalemate ever since. So the issue is, whether or not they can anytime soon kind of recreate that effort to negotiate a broader deal, and when. I don't think anybody thinks it'll happen between now and the end of the year. I think the real issue is whether they can bring themselves to sit down and actually have a civil conversation with each other between now and, say, December. So we'll see how that goes. One thing worth noting is that the one person who was not in any of those discussions was Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. So he was just kind of, obviously, observing and informed, but he was not going to get involved in any of those types of early discussions. So unemployment and PPP have already expired. There's another program that expires at the end of September, substantial aid to airlines. It was included in one of the earlier, I think it was the CARES package back in April. That expires, and according to the airline industry, if it doesn't get extended, then thousands of airline employees will be laid off. That does not appear to be any sort of an action of forcing event either. So we still have other programs that are about to expire. The Surface Transportation Program, the FAST Act, that expires at the end of September. Flood insurance program expires at the end of September. And so in theory anyways, whenever they get around to doing a continuing resolution, they will, I believe, extend a variety of programs like flood insurance, surface transportation, probably for a year. Those are relatively non-controversial. Whether anybody has the appetite to kind of branch out beyond that and try to include anything on a phase 4 bill remains to be seen. Maybe more money for testing, some sort of COVID relief, hospitals, schools, vaccine, or whatever. So far, everybody's saying, no, we're not going to do that. But I just have this gut feeling as they get closer to the deadline, more and more pressure will build. The other wild card hanging out all of this is President Trump himself. It goes without saying, everybody gets mixed signals from one day to the next as to what he will actually sign into law. So in theory anyway, the House and Senate could pass a continuing resolution. Let's hope President Trump is able to see his way to actually sign it into law to avoid a government shutdown. I don't think anybody at this point is making a political calculation that shutting down the government is a good idea in this situation, but having been through these situations before in the past, it doesn't happen frequently that they intentionally shut the government down. Usually what happens is they unintentionally shut it down and stumble into one, mostly because one side blaming the other or making irresponsible demands. So that is that's the game. That's the landscape between now and the end of September. Hanging over all this, as I know everybody wants to hear about, is the coronavirus legislation itself, prospects for a deal. Like I said, you never say never in this business, but judging from kind of the body language and just sort of the, temper tantrums, I don't see really a prospect for a broad deal, much less one on the scope that we've seen in some of the previous piece of legislation that got signed into law. So I think a couple of things just to kind of keep an eye on. The two main competing proposals, the Senate Republicans, you may have seen back in, I think it was middle of August, released what they call a Senate skinny bill, and that is so-called skinny in relation to the House Democrats' HEROES Act, that passed back in May. It was a $3.5 trillion bill. The Senate released a bill that was somewhere in the neighborhood of, or the Senate Republicans, somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion. It included a variety of much slimmed down features from where Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats are. It included a $300 weekly supplemental unemployment insurance payment that would go for the rest of this year. It included liability protections, virtually, pretty close to what we had proposed way back in, I think, March or April. Liability protections for businesses and healthcare providers. That has always been a top priority for McConnell, as it has been for us. The Paycheck Protection Program in the Senate skinny bill would have provided forgivable loans to small businesses, would have been revived. Like I said, the current program expired on August 8th. It also would have converted for the Postal Service a $10 billion loan into an actual grant. We heard a lot of furor over the Postal Service. It would include, I think, a little over $100 billion in education funds, 2/3 of which would go to elementary and secondary schools. About 30% would go to higher education colleges. And then there would also be about $45 billion to the Health and Human Services Department for healthcare type things like vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, things like that. So that was the initial bargaining position from the Senate Republicans that were responding to, like I said, the HEROES Act that the House passed back in May. Quite candidly, it didn't go anywhere. Senator McConnell had a real struggle to even get a consensus within the Senate Republican conference as to whether to even move forward on the package. He finally managed. They had to release a somewhat fatter, skinny bill about a week or so ago that included more money for child care and also some school choice provisions that were very important to some of the conservatives in his caucus. So once they added those features to it, he was able to bring it to the Senate floor and got 52 of the 53 Senate Republicans to vote for it, which is under the circumstances, a remarkable achievement that he was able to get that many Republican senators, because Senate Republicans have been really badly split within the conference about a variety of different issues. So things have been at loggerheads ever since. They passed their bill. Well, they got 52 votes for it. The Senate Democrats blocked it, and you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass anything. So that's where that stands. As I mentioned earlier, the House Democratic proposal is still what it was back in May, which is their HEROES Act. Like I said, included $3.5 trillion for a variety of different things. 600. That's where they have the $600 unemployment benefit and aid to state and local governments. So that's where things are kind of stalled between those two bills at this point. So the real question is, as we've been asking ourselves since really the middle of the summer, is when will serious negotiations actually begin? And there's no sign of that anytime soon. Like I said, they never really started. They had a lot of acrimonious meetings amongst themselves, but nothing ever came out of that. So fast forward all the way up until this week, the Congress reconvened. It's been interesting, kind of some of the behind the scenes, the undercurrents that are going on, particularly within the House Democratic Caucus. The anxiety is rising pretty rapidly on Speaker Pelosi. She would prefer to hold the line and not make any further concessions to either the White House or Senate Republicans. In the meantime, kind of caught in the crossfire are a variety of House Democratic moderates, and particularly their freshman members. The political dynamic that's playing out here is, even though the Senate Republican bill, didn't pass the Senate last week, it at least gave the Senate Republicans something to say they were for. Particularly their senators who are in difficult re-election races. So like Cory Gardner, Colorado, Susan Collins up in Maine, are at least able to say, well, at least I voted for something. It's unfortunately the Senate Democrats blocked it. Well, the House Democrats, particularly the freshmen, and some of the ones who are running in competitive seats, the last vote they've had was in May, which seems like an eternity ago. And so they feel like they're in a weak position politically, going back to their constituents and saying, it's unfortunate we can't pass anything, but I voted for something back in the middle of May. That's a difficult position to be in. So as a result, what's been happening with the House Democrats is several of them are pushing for more narrow rifle shot votes on a variety of different issues, nowhere near the broad scope of a phase 4 bill. But things like maybe a standalone vote on just extending PPP, or a standalone vote on additional unemployment, things like that the pressure is growing, and the speaker is getting squeezed, frankly, by some members of our own caucus. So yesterday, the new development was there's a group called the House Problem Solvers Caucus. It's a coalition, over 50 members of Democrats led by Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey and Tom Reed from New York. And what they have done is they came out yesterday with their proposal, which is an attempt to strike kind of a middle ground between, as I indicated before, the HEALS Act, the Senate Republicans' HEALS Act, and the House Democrats' HEROES Act. So some of the key elements of that actually track a lot with what the chamber recommended way back in, I think, April or May, where we sent a letter to leadership and members of Congress and the White House saying, okay, here's our, kind of our middle ground proposal for where we think, quite candidly, negotiations would end up. Now, unfortunately, like I said, negotiation never occurred. But the proposal that the House Problem Solvers Caucus laid out yesterday tracks a lot with what we actually recommended. I don't want to overstate our influence, but in any event, it does strike a kind of a middle ground, particularly on some of the key features. So, like on state and local aid, the Senate, the original Senate bill had I think $150 billion for some version of state and local aid. House Democrats had $915. So you just do the math, and what the problem solvers came up with was $500 billion for state and local governments. Now, there's a tremendous amount of resistance, particularly among Republicans, about giving any form of state and local aid for a variety of, quite candidly, political reasons. They do not want to be in a position of sending billions of dollars to cities that are having severe financial problems, like Chicago, for example. So there's real resistance from among Republicans to provide any more. Our point, we have a different view. We do think there's a good case to be made for why state and local governments need more money. On unemployment, they try to split the difference again. As I said, the House Democrats are at $600 billion, or $600 a week. The Senate Republicans are at $300. What they're proposing is $450 a week for 8 weeks, after which 100%, after which an employee's wages would be capped at 100% of their previous wages, or $600 a week. Again, that tracks pretty closely with what we proposed back in April. It also includes $1,200 in stimulus checks. That was not a part of the Senate Republican bill. It includes more money for testing, schools, childcare, and it also includes liability reform, which we were quite encouraged by. Now, they don't go into a lot of specifics about what would include, nowhere near the level of detail that we proposed or the Senate Republicans included in their proposal. It's just very vague language, which I frankly think is smart on their part. Something to the effect of they propose enhanced protections for entities following strengthened OSHA guidelines and robust enforcement of worker safety. So we took that as a good sign that they were not very prescriptive and are very much open to some of the ideas that we're proposing. So that was the problem solvers. They're in the middle of all this, trying to get people to not only sit down and negotiate, but kind of lay out sort of an end game as to where people could end up. Now, the frustrating part, as I said before, is I don't really see it got kind of universally panned by both sides yesterday. It was roughly I think they're $1.5 trillion. It's a lot higher than where the Senate Republicans are, and a lot less than where the House Democrats are. Although the White House did indicate at one point that they would be comfortable with $1.5 trillion. So, it's hard to really kind of look at all this and sort of see a center of gravity, but some of the broad contours are really starting to come into play. So that's really pretty much, the state of play on keeping the government open, where things stand or don't stand on the phase 4 provision. This sets everything up for a gigantic collision course in December. Like I said, particularly if they try to wrap up all the appropriation bills, all the work that's been left undone, another version of a phase 4 bill will all come to a head sometime in December, and it all hinges really on who wins on election day. So like I said earlier, if it's Trump and the Senate stays Republican, I would expect a continuing resolution until sometime in December, and then it'll be a real blowout, I hate to say, in terms of the size of the bill. Dealing with trillions and trillions of dollars. It'll be really one for the ages. It'll include, like I said, all the appropriations bills, which are, bumped up by hundreds of billions of dollars for COVID relief. There'll be expiring tax provisions in there, and a whole variety of other programs that will be included. The other side is, and frankly, I hate to say this, but if that's the scenario, the odds of the government shutdown will increase. As particularly Senate Democrats are going to be really unhappy that they didn't either take control of the Senate or win the presidency. They're not going to be in any mood to cooperate with anybody. And so they'll use whatever leverage they have to kind of try to kick issues into next year when the Senate Republicans will likely have an even a narrower margin than they already do in terms of the votes. And then the flip side is the other alternative, as I indicated before. If Biden wins and the Senate goes Democratic, I would expect a CR, continuing resolution, until sometime early next year, most likely March. Then looking ahead to next year, like I said, it really all hinges on 2021. I'm operating in the assumption that the election is going to be close. There'll be a lot of bitterness, but no matter who wins, there'll be very different policy agendas, very stark differences, beginning with President Trump, who doesn't really even have one. And then, we have Vice President Biden, who's been working very closely with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I expect them to be very influential in kind of laying out what a potential Senate Democratic agenda would be. Having said all that, no matter who wins, the state economy will be top of the agenda for both sides. You'll see both Biden and Trump would have, like I said, very dramatically different approaches. And in order to get anything done, both sides are going to have to find some way to try to tack back to the center, which will be very, very difficult considering the environment they'll be operating on. The other driving factor here is what the stock markets be doing? It seems like they're doing really well now. Will that continue? And the odds are, if you look at the polls and the betting markets, we'll be dealing with a unified government with Democrats having somewhat expanded majorities in the House, marginal control of the Senate, I think, and then of course the White House. And then I've been around long enough where I've seen on both sides under unified government scenario, there's tremendous pressure to overreach and try to get as many things done as quickly as possible. And then what happens is they kind of outrun their supply lines and things kind of grind to a halt. So let me stop there. I think I was supposed to talk for about 30 minutes. I think that's about 30 minutes. I'm happy to try to answer any questions, or if there are things I saw some of the questions that you submitted. I think I've kind of ticked off most of them. But one thing I should talk about real quickly is the executive orders. I know somebody was asking about that.
Right.
Back in, I think it was the middle of August, as a result of all this stalemate, President Trump decided to try to seize control of the agenda and issued 4 primary executive orders. One on the deferral of the payroll tax collection that essentially would delay the collection of the payroll tax until December 31st for workers making less than, I think it's $104,000 a year. In all candor, I don't think that's, I don't get the impression that a lot of companies are taking advantage of that. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of complexity about how best to do that for companies. And I think, from what I can tell anyway, anecdotally, it looks like most of them have just kind of decided to take a pass on that. The other executive order was on unemployment benefits. They proposed extending unemployment at $400 a week until, I think it was early December, or until the money ran out. The twist there was that states had to come up with 25% of the benefits, or $100 per person, which I don't think a lot of states are really in a position to do that. Student loan payments, they also issued an executive order that essentially waives all interest on student loans through 2020 and defers payments until I think next year. Again, that's hung up with, I think, people in the Education Department and Treasury Department trying to have best to make that work. And then finally, there was another one on rent evictions. That was one of the other deadlines that expired last summer, the moratorium on rent evictions. It's really, I mean, it's not, I don't think most observers thought that was much of a serious effort, because there's somewhat limited legally in what the president could or couldn't do. Really, all it did was call on Treasury Department and Housing and Urban Development to identify potential federal funding that could possibly provide assistance to renters and homeowners who are having a hard time with their rent or mortgages, but they never really set up any kind of a process. So this is my own view. I think they were more symbolic than anything else, and particularly with the presidential election looming, it afforded President Trump the opportunity to say, okay, Congress couldn't get its act together, so I'm going to do this for you. But like I said, in real world practical impact, I haven't noticed much of an impact. So let me stop there. And like I said, if I missed something or anybody wants me to elaborate on anything, happy to try to do that.
Well, Jack, thanks so much for that. I have just probably a couple of follow-up questions here, and we can certainly explore what questions our members have as they're tuning in for this. So if you'd like to utilize the chat function to submit questions, I'll certainly relay those. You can also email Lauren Musto on our team. That's lmustoe, LMUSTOE, at springfieldchamber.com, and we'll try to get to those questions. We have several already. One of the things, Jack, that I've always admired, and especially I think during this time, about U.S. Chamber's work, is the way that, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of who controls what, which party's doing what, your head is always down looking for the opening, for the window of opportunity. One of the ways that I know U.S. Chamber has done that during this period of time is by launching this cost of inaction campaign. Yeah. There's an enormous cost to the gridlock that you've described well here. Can you talk just a little bit about that effort, maybe how you're highlighting and quantifying, bringing awareness to some of the impacts that come from inaction right now at the federal level?
I think thanks for mentioning that, because we have put a lot of effort into that, and it's an effort on our part just to continue to remind lawmakers, policymakers here in DC, that their failure to act is having real world consequences for not only businesses, but families and people who are really suffering out there because, Republicans and Democrats on the Hill just can't seem to get together to negotiate a package. There's really kind of a vacuum of any sort of, leadership here. And it's one thing to engage in, a lot of political attacks and rhetorical arguments and things like that, but real people are hurting here. And particularly, like I said, several of these programs have already expired. Unemployment's expired, the supplemental benefits expired, and Chambers, we're not for the $600. That clearly had some economic ramifications that we would have preferred not to see. But there still is, there is still a need for some people out there. There's, 20 million people still unemployed, even though, the stock market's going up, unemployment rates dropping down. There's still a lot of need out there. A lot of businesses are is barely hanging on. The PPP program has expired. I think most people think it was a, relatively successful program. There were, a lot of flaws in it, and I'm sure they're going to see a lot of, a lot of the money went to people. I saw a bunch of NFL players got some money, but by and large, it kept the economy afloat. Same thing for the stimulus checks. Really helped, people just kind of meet their day-to-day expenses. All that's gone. And with the prospect of Congress going to leave here at the end of the month and not come back until December. So we're doing everything we can. Like I said, the cost of inaction, we send out regular updates. We actually rely very heavily on our state and local chambers to tell us what they're hearing on the ground so that we can sort of amplify that message to policymakers. Say, look, get over your, rhetorical arguments. These people in your state, in your congressional district are losing their jobs, to say nothing of the health considerations. So we're going to keep the pressure up. We were one of the few groups yesterday who put out a positive statement on the Problem Solvers Caucus. So it's a high priority, and it's only going to even grow as we get into the fall.
So I'm kind of intrigued by this Problem Solvers Caucus that you mentioned, and if not them specifically, at least the approach. I think, one of the things that in some ways it's a little surprising that there have been 4 large relief packages come out of divided Congress in an election year period.
Yeah.
So then the question is, or I guess 3. So then if the 4th one's not likely to happen in a large scale kind of a vehicle, then what is maybe there is something to an approach of going at some of these things a little more piecemeal. And so in that spirit, I think what I'd like to do, Jack, is maybe zero in on a few of the elements of a package and have you maybe talk about what some of the key factors or issues are on each of these individually, because some, one way or another, there are, as you said, some very specific things that need to be addressed. Mm-hmm. You mentioned PPP. That program, of course, has been very helpful to our members and to the business community generally here, and I know a lot of other places as well. When that came, obviously there was an expectation probably for most that bridge would only need to go so far, and the pandemic battle has gone longer than most expected at that time. So then the question, as you said, is extension of it. I have sort of a related question. We've had a number of several of the banks here are advising many of their customers, many of whom are prepared and ready to have their loans forgiven at this point. That maybe it might be not a bad idea to wait a little bit to do that, in hopes that the process for forgiveness might be streamlined a little bit in a forthcoming bill. Are you hearing anything about that?
Yeah, there does seem to be. I don't want to get too far ahead of things. Particularly people are dealing with real money and real loans, but there does seem to be growing support for some sort of a version of forgiveness. We've been advocating for extending the deadline, obviously past August 8th, until the end of the year. We may, if Congress doesn't get around to doing a deal until December, we may, recommend extending even further than that. We've also been advocating, I know this affects, a lot of our local chambers, particularly smaller ones, making all the nonprofit employers eligible to apply for those PPP programs. So we think the PPP, the forgiveness process, should be easier. We're also urging a replenishment of the SBA's EIDL program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Mm-hmm. But it's, there is a consensus. It is one of those things where there is sort of a common ground between the House Democrats and Senate Republicans that PPP should be extended in some fashion. It's just kind of caught up in these larger kind of macroeconomic issues, and particularly, really, there's actually a more common ground here between the House Democrats bill and the Senate Republicans bill than you could tell just by looking at the headlines. Really, the only outstanding major issues are aid to state and local governments, where, like I said, these Senate Republicans are very reluctant to send hundreds of billions of dollars more to state and local governments. And look, I'm not being pejorative. I understand their point, which is, first of all, they always, spend about $6 trillion bills, $6 trillion. It's more than the annual budget. But their other point is that the vast majority of those funds have not yet been allocated by state governments. And so their point is, why spend another trillion or $1.5 trillion dollars, and just when states really, for one reason or another, just have not even spent that money themselves. So there's that, and then the other real kind of sticking point at this point is what to do with unemployment, the benefits. Like I said, the Senate Republicans, it took a while for McConnell to get his conference to support even $300 a week, and the Senate or the House Democrats were at 600. So, the problem solvers, again, just do the math and you come up with 450.
So Jack, that's a great perspective, and I actually want to follow up with you on a couple of those key sort of sticking points: state and local governments and liability reform. Also, before I do that, though, we have a question from one of our members who dropped this on the chat. It's really great question. I think probably has relevance likely to most of the people who are listening right now, and that is the question about forgiveness of any CARES Act program. So PPP is the most well-known one, but if you get, if you receive some of this funding for relief for small businesses through CARES Act that's being administered by state and local governments, for example, or for that matter, forgivable PPP loan. What this question is centered around hearing that will be treated as taxable income.
Yeah.
And then the question is there any talk about revisiting that question? That obviously could create a pretty significant tax liability for some businesses.
Well, that's exactly right. No, that is another one of our priorities once they actually get around to negotiating a deal, is to try to address that. Unfortunately, the discussions aren't far enough along to know how realistic that is. They haven't reached that level of detail yet. I mean, they're still arguing about over the overall size of the package. $3.5 billion.
It feels like one of those issues that hasn't received very much attention, but could have an enormous impact.
No, and we sent several letters to the Hill making exactly that point. But again, it's kind of getting lost in the overall furor over, just kind of the size of the package. But yeah, once they actually sit down and start negotiating, that'll be one of our top priorities.
On the issue of liability reform, Jack, I know you mentioned that there are some different versions. There's the version of the Senate bill, and then the Problem Solvers Caucus had a little more general version of that. What are the key sort of elements of a meaningful, successful liability reform bill for businesses that are your high priorities as you advocate?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the liability legal expert, but I can just kind of give you sort of a layman's understanding as to what we're proposing. And actually, this is something we've been working on for a long time. Tom Donahue will say liability reform has been his top priority. He rejoined the chamber back in 1997. So in any event, back in April, again, it seems like an eternity ago, we started talking with people on the Hill, Republicans and Democrats, and the White House about what we're proposing, what we call timely, targeted, and temporary liability protection. We don't want anybody under the impression that we're doing any sort of radical rewrite of liability reform. And so we wanted to just really focus on COVID-related lawsuits that we think are going to be a huge drag on businesses who are trying to reopen. And, even beyond that, schools and universities are all wrestling with the same thing. So we came up with basically three main components that, like I said, for the most part, were included in Senator McConnell's bill. I mean, the first one would be protecting those businesses that make, good faith efforts to follow government guidance as they know it, to prevent COVID-19 exposures, with obviously exceptions for, willful misconduct, gross negligence, and by truly bad actors. The second key component is protecting the healthcare workers and facilities themselves who are on the front line against medical liability claims that would come out of a COVID-19 related healthcare. And then third, the other main element is providing further product liability protections under an existing federal law, the PREP Act, for manufacturers who produce vital personal protective equipment and other countermeasures like that. So those are the broad concepts that we've been pushing. And, fortunately, a lot of them were incorporated in Senator McConnell's skinny bill. And, I hate to read too much into it. Liability reform has really not been a flashpoint between the Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. Now, it may be once they actually sit down and start negotiating a bill. Again, to my earlier point, they really even got past sort of the top line total. But we took it as a very positive sign that the House Problem Solvers Caucus, like I said, it's roughly 50 members split among Democrats and Republicans, all signed on to an understanding of the need that they do something to address the threat of lawsuits and give some liability protections to employers beyond the business community. Because the other strategic thing we're doing is working with universities and school groups, because they need the same protections too. So we're trying to broaden that coalition and work with non-traditional allies, higher education community in particular, who are all grappling with the same sort of issue. So Senator McConnell, to his credit, has declared this liability reform a red line, and has said over and over again to us privately and also publicly that no phase 4 bill or whatever coronavirus legislation is going to pass without liability reform in it. So we're pretty encouraged by that, but it's essential that we keep the pressure up on this, because once they get around to negotiating a deal, it's going to be a very small group of people. It'll be the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, the Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, McConnell, and the White House. And we've had conversations with the White House, and they tell us too, this is one of their priorities. But we all know once you get behind those closed doors, things can change. And so we need to do everything we can to strengthen Senator McConnell's leverage in particular, because there'll be a lot of horse trading once they get into those negotiating sessions.
Jack, has this process, or even just this year of working through these issues, illuminated the need for longer-term infrastructure investments in any particular areas? I'm thinking, certainly I always think about transportation, we talk infrastructure, but I'm thinking things like rural broadband or other long-term investments. Yeah,
and that was one of the things that the Problem Solvers Caucus laid out yesterday. Was I forgot what the title, but was significant increases in money for broadband, rural broadband in particular, because one of the things we've learned, unfortunately, here is that even though a lot of people are home working remotely and virtually, well, there's a lot of people who aren't able to use broadband, particularly lower income people or students and things like that. So yeah, they propose a pretty robust increase in broadband funding. And then on your point about infrastructure generally, this is and has been one of our top priorities, certainly in the last, under the Trump presidency. It's been a priority for a long time, but we thought the kind of stars were aligning under President Trump, who seemed very interested in doing a large-scale infrastructure bill. For one reason or another, that sort of fell by the wayside. But I would expect, again, fast-forwarding to next year, candidly, under no matter who wins, if the economy is still continuing to struggle, I would expect, particularly under Biden presidency, one of the first things they're going to want to do is some sort of an economic recovery or stimulus program of some kind. And I would think that a robust program to rebuild our highways and bridges and broadband and things like that would be one of the first things they try to do.
That'd be a great rally in 2021. We would certainly be all for that here. Like you, it's been a high priority for quite some time, and just you need the right opportunity, the right alignment of the stars, as you said. So,
Yeah.
Jack, I just am so grateful for you spending the time with us today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It's gone quickly.
Yeah.
I want to give you a big thank you again, Jack Howard with the U.S. Chamber, for providing these timely insights and knowledge on federal policy. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has a lot of boots on the ground in Washington, and your organization has just been enormously helpful in communicating with and partnering with local chambers of commerce like ours as we work to support the small businesses in our region. So I also want to thank, so thanks so much, Jack, for being with us today.
You're welcome.
I also want to thank all of our members who joined us today. If your question was not answered, we worked hard to try to get to all of those questions. But if you have another one that comes up or you need more clarification on anything discussed, please reach out to Lauren Musto on our public affairs team. Again, that email address is lmustoe, LMUSTOE at springfieldchamber.com. And we will do our best to get answers to your questions. And you can always keep visiting. Please do keep visiting the Chamber website. Look for Chamber emails for up-to-date business, safety, and policy-related information. If you're looking to get the latest just on business resources related to COVID, you can always go to springfieldchamber.com/coronavirus. And that is constantly updated still with lots of relevant current information that is helping businesses get back to work and hopefully work their way toward a strong economic recovery. Now, we know guidance and resources are consistently evolving as all of us really work through this pandemic together. And so just please know that we're here to continue supporting you and connecting you with timely information during this crisis. As always, we're so grateful for your membership and for your engagement and leadership in our community. And I want to thank you for being a part of the Springfield Area Chamber of Commerce.